This is AC. I have OJ in the car.
Okay, where are you?
Please, I'm coming up the 5 freeway.
Okay.
Right now, we are okay, but you got to tell the police to just back off. He's still alive.
Welcome back to GMA. 95 million people tuned into that slow-speed Bronco chase live in 1994. We're going to have more on the reaction after the death of O.J. Simpson and a closer look at the trial that changed America. Our senior national affairs correspondent, Deborah Roberts, is here with more for us. Good morning, Deborah.
Good morning, Michael. And who can forget that video? O.J. Simpson's legacy should be a classic American success story. A kid who made his way out of poverty to become a Heisman Trophy winner, a handsome, successful pitchman and actor, the face of Hollywood wealth and celebrity. But this morning, many will only remember him as the famous murder defendant.
Good morning again, ladies and gentlemen.
It was the trial of the century. O.J. Simpson, a former football superstar turned Hollywood darling, accused of murdering ex-wife Nicole Brown Simpson and her friend Ron Goldman in 1994. Wall-to-wall coverage of the 8-month trial setting viewing records, the case sparking an appetite for courtroom drama.
By the time the O.J. Simpson trial came to be, you had that entire frustration from the Black community and other people of color who had been upset by the LAPD specifically.
The trial changing the course of TV coverage before it even began. Days after the murders, 95 million watching live coverage of Simpson's white Ford Bronco's slow-speed police chase.
Please, I'm coming up the 5 freeway.
The famous suspect eventually surrendering, but the media frenzy was only beginning. Simpson's defense lawyers, dubbed the Dream Team, led by Robert Shapiro, Robert Kardashian, and Johnny Cochran. Brian Dunn working closely alongside them.
This case was about social divisions, and a lot of these things were starkly brought into focus by the circumstances of this case. But to us, we were simply trying to give this man a fair trial to the best of our abilities.
The team soon framing the murder case into a commentary about race in America, focusing on the LAPD and questions about injustice.
Out of nowhere, we were given a series of tapes that had some incredibly inflammatory, racially inflammatory remarks from this particular individual who was the lead detective. It was not planned, but Mr. Cochran was not going to downplay it.
Cato Kalin, a key witness, saying they knew how to speak to a jury.
I saw that they actually were a dream team, and I knew that seeing the jurors and seeing Johnny Cochran and the way he had his language, and they knew how to convince doubt in the mind of the jurors.
On the opposite side, the prosecution led by Marcia Clark with Christopher Darden. Then this turning point, which some called the legal blunder of the century. Prosecutors asking Simpson to try on the blood-stained gloves found at the crime to prove he did it. Simpson appearing to struggle to get them on, leading to one of the most famous lines ever spoken in a criminal trial.
If it doesn't fit, you must acquit.
When the jury's verdict was announced, 150 million tuned in.
We, the jury, in the above entitled action, find the defendant, Orenthal James Simpson, not guilty of the crime of murder.
Oprah watching with her show's live audience. The reaction split, just as it was nationwide. Large numbers of blacks celebrating what some saw as long-awaited judicial vindication. Many whites seeing a travesty of a killer going free.
76-year-old O.J. Simpson did eventually serve 9 years in prison for his role in a Las Vegas armed robbery involving his sports memorabilia. He was released 7 years ago. George?
Okay, Deb, thanks. Let's bring in our chief legal analyst, Dan Abrams, and our ABC News Live contributor, managing partner at the Cochran firm, Shanna Lloyd. Dan, I have to begin with you. I remember seeing you in that courtroom every single day. Just bring us back there. What was it like inside?
So very different inside the courtroom and outside the courtroom. Inside the courtroom, there were very strict rules. We were all sort of packed into the pews every day watching the case. There was decorum. There was, metal detectors, everything to get into the courtroom. Outside the courtroom, it was a circus. There were people selling hats. There were people selling Jell-O molds. There were people selling a watch that had the Bronco being chased by police as the second hands. They had every sort of imaginable baseball cap of every participant in the case. It was night and day between inside that courtroom and outside that courtroom.
And I mean, it's just one of those things that's happened. You'll never forget where you were, and we all kind of tuned in to watch that. And Shauna, you're with the Cochran firm now. So what is the legacy of this case, and what does it say about Johnny Cochran?
You know, it's interesting. This case, although Johnny fought for civil rights his entire career, this actually really brought it to the forefront, right? It brought about the racial divide that was happening in LA at the time. It talked about how lawyers make a difference in being sure that the police and the state are held to a certain standard before they can incarcerate someone. And so here at the firm, the legacy is really that we fight for our clients. We make sure that they have a proper defense, and we make sure that we always put our best foot forward, and we do what we do best, which is advocate for our clients.
Johnny became, by the way, one of the most famous people in America. I mean, I can tell you, months after the case, I'd walk down the street with Johnny Cochran, who became a friend of mine. There was no former president, there was no rock star you could walk with who had more recognition on the street than Johnny Cochran in the months after this case.
I can believe that.
Dan brought up the circus that was happening outside the courtroom. This was so polarizing. How did that factor into the trial and the strategy?
I mean, race was at the base at what they were arguing, right? When we look at the officer that testified and the racial statements that he had made and other things, the shoddy police work, it didn't quite meet the standard that it should have. There was this rush to judgment, this idea that they may have planted evidence. So that played a very pivotal role in the particular trial and how it turned out.
Of course, he was acquitted in the criminal trial, Dan, not so in the civil.
Yeah, I mean, look, the argument that they made was masterful, but also somewhat absurd in the context of the case, and that was exposed in the civil case, right? Because you had the blood evidence, you had the fiber evidence, you had the glove evidence, you had the domestic violence evidence, you had all these pieces of evidence, and then finally in the civil case, they got the big one that people forget about, which is there was a size 12 Bruno Magli shoe that was the bloody footprint at the scene. O.J. Simpson wore a size 12. They weren't able to quite link it to O.J. Simpson in the criminal case. Then in the civil case, O.J. Simpson had to actually answer questions under oath. And he said, I never would have worn those ugly shoes. They then found a Buffalo Bills newsletter from 8 months before the murder. O.J. Simpson was wearing the ugly shoes. So now you have O.J. Simpson wearing the shoes of the killer, same size. And so for anyone who had any questions after the criminal case, they should have been addressed.
How did it end up that none of that came up in the criminal case?
They never found it in the criminal case. It came up only in the context of the civil case. That one piece of evidence, that Buffalo Bills newsletter, which there was just nothing that Simpson could say in response to that one.
Wow.
And Shauna, real quickly, how do you think people are going to look back on O.J. Simpson?
You know, I think they're going to look back with mixed feelings on him himself, but I think the bigger picture is what his legacy left, right? He did many things. First of all, he launched all of Court TV and just this fascination with trials. He also was one of the first athletes to have endorsements. That changed the way athletes interact with their brand. Also, let's think about the fact that he actually brought attorneys and what we do and why the legal system and the injustice in the legal system, it really came to the forefront. So I think it's more about the legacy and the macro effect of what that trial and his life really did.
Shauna, Dan, thank you both so much.